Do you know what's difficult for me to wrap my head around? What it really means to speak Spanish fluently. If you didn't know, I have made multiple videos about this topic because I love it so much, but it still has been quite challenging to narrow down the definition to just one sentence. When I first started this journey of learning Spanish on my own after college, my definition of speaking Spanish fluently was just sounding exactly like a native Spanish speaker and speaking perfectly. My trip to Mexico a few years ago, which was the first ever Spanish speaking country that I ever visited, gave me a really big reality check into this definition that I had. It was incredibly challenging for me to speak Spanish there, and actually many times I reverted to using English just because I found it so difficult to communicate in Spanish. After my Mexico trip, I started to self-study a lot, and I thought to myself, okay, maybe I just need to learn a lot more Spanish words. So that's what I started to do, and honestly, that still failed me, unfortunately, because at the time I thought that it was going to be the key to speaking Spanish fluently. You have, many different words in your head, and that was what is going to actually help me speak Spanish fluently. It only makes sense, right? But that did not work. I couldn't just learn many Spanish words and start speaking Spanish fluently. I actually had to understand that grammar is a big part of that as well. I need to be able to learn how to create sentences, how to connect these words together. Okay, then speaking Spanish fluently does not mean that I know 5,000 or 10,000 or 15,000 Spanish words. But then I thought that, okay, maybe I just need to study a lot more. So I started to increase the amount of hours that I was studying Spanish every single day. So I would try to read as much as possible. I would try to listen to a podcast or a few different podcasts in Spanish for as long as possible, watch many different movies and TV shows, and just write a lot as well. So I was going to study myself to speaking Spanish fluently, and guess what? That did not go as planned. I ended up actually burning out because I was so exhausted because I would stay up super late trying to study Spanish as much as possible, but my body honestly just couldn't take it because I was just pushing myself past my limit. Now I know this method actually came from my college days because I would do the same thing. I would just stay up super late with a few monsters and just study for as long as possible so I could try to learn as much as possible and pass my classes. But this method was not the best for learning Spanish. So speaking Spanish fluently in this case does not mean that I have studied Spanish for 10,000 hours or 15,000 hours. After these experiences, I learned that I wasn't going to be able to just force my way to speaking Spanish fluently, but it was going to take some time. It was going to take some new strategies, and that speaking Spanish fluently was more about developing the skill to speak and communicate in this new language that I was learning. I started to have many conversations with native Spanish speakers, so I was really developing this skill of communicating and knowing the ins and the outs of having a conversation. So I started to get very familiar with what speaking Spanish fluently actually was to me at that time. But then that changed drastically when I went to the Dominican Republic because this really challenged my definition of speaking Spanish fluently. Before actually getting to the Dominican Republic, I felt quite confident that I was going to be able to communicate there just fine because I was studying Spanish consistently. I was having conversations in Spanish in person consistently, so this shouldn't be that difficult. However, when I got to DR, my mentality completely changed because I was incredibly stressed because I did not understand really anybody when I was there. And also when I compared myself to the Dominicans, well, I did not sound like them. I did not have the same accent as them. I definitely didn't have the same vocabulary that they had. I did not know any Dominican slang because this was my first time ever being there. And I definitely could not speak as fast as them. So then I started to think to myself, well, okay, this means that I am not fluent because I can't sound exactly like Dominicans. And it just seems like nobody can understand me, I can't understand them, and my communication is just absolutely terrible. And I felt like this, and I had these thoughts for a while that I was not a fluent Spanish speaker because of all these different reasons and my experience in DR. Pero afortunadamente, I started to think more about the situation, and I was like, you know what? I could actually be in the DR, and I was speaking Spanish only. I never had to really revert back to English just because I wasn't able to speak Spanish, or I couldn't find the right words. If I did not understand something, that I could ask questions in Spanish. I could explain what I was confused about just fine, so I could actually get an answer. And then I also realized that I actually should not be putting so much pressure on myself to know everything about the slang that was used in the Dominican Republic. I shouldn't pressure myself to speak exactly like Dominicans because that wouldn't make sense if it's my first time there. So that's when I started to get more clarity on what speaking Spanish fluently meant even more. In this case, I couldn't trust my feelings for helping me determine what this definition was. And I know that some people actually do use that. They say that, okay, I feel like I'm fluent, therefore I am fluent, or I speak Spanish fluently. And for me, that is not the case. I can't just go off my feelings because, I mean, even a few weeks ago, I felt like I wasn't speaking Spanish fluently because, I made some mistakes and I wasn't pronouncing things correctly. So I can't just go off of my feelings all the time because my feelings aren't necessarily reality. Those days that I feel very insecure about the way that I speak Spanish, I usually have very negative thoughts about myself and the way that I speak, and then I criticize every little mistake that I make. Now I factor in my feelings so I understand how to explain what speaking Spanish fluently is. Because again, if I just go off of my feelings, then most of my insecurities, like making mistakes, means that I do not speak Spanish fluently, and that's not the case either. Of course, as language learners, as a Spanish learner, even as a native English speaker, I'm going to be making mistakes. I'm going to be making grammar mistakes like ser versus estar. So sometimes that kind of makes me a little irritated if I make a mistake like that. But again, that is just how things go. Mistakes happen. So not just grammar mistakes, but also making pronunciation mistakes as well. So if I just went off my feelings, then I would say that, okay, I did not pronounce the word desafortunadamente correctly, because that word is actually very difficult for me to pronounce. But if I go off of that, then again, I don't speak Spanish fluently, but I don't think that is the case. I think that making pronunciation mistakes is quite normal. I mean, I do it all the time, even in these videos when I speak English. Also, a few years ago, I used to think that having complex vocabulary meant that you speak Spanish fluently, because when I used to speak with one of my friends from Guatemala, he used to use a lot of big adjectives or how do I say this? Very long adjectives and nouns and things like that to describe things, and I could not do that the same way. But that still did not mean that I could not speak Spanish fluently, just because I did not have all this complex vocabulary, or I would say, I guess maybe it's more of like a higher level Spanish, just because I just started to speak Spanish a few years ago. And he is, he is about 13 or 14 years older than I am. So of course, and he's from Guatemala. So he grew up in a Spanish speaking country. So I shouldn't be comparing myself in the first place to him. But just by not having that type of vocabulary that he has does not mean that I can't speak Spanish fluently. Speaking Spanish without any pauses. So before, this used to give me a lot of insecurity as well, because I thought that I had to speak just incredibly fast, like as fast as I would hear news reporters on YouTube videos and things like that for me to speak Spanish fluently. But again, for me, that is not the case. I think that's kind of ridiculous to think that I can just speak as fast as humanly possible in comparison to other native speakers, because I can go at my own pace and I can still communicate in Spanish just fine. Now, today, speaking Spanish fluently to me means that I'm able to have conversations in Spanish about common topics fluently with Spanish speakers without having to revert back to English, and also being able to express myself when communicating in Spanish as I do when I speak English. So that has to do with being able to express emotion. It has a lot to do with my cadence for speaking as well, and my pronunciation, but not pronouncing things perfectly, but just to the level where the other person can understand what I'm saying. That is kind of a long definition, but honestly right now that is the best way that I can actually explain what speaking Spanish fluently means to me. And again, I want to stress that very clearly, that this is just my own definition based off of my experiences learning Spanish and developing the skill to speak Spanish and getting to the level that I have today. And I am not a linguist, I am not a Spanish teacher or a tutor, and I did not graduate college with any degrees in Spanish. I am just a student of the Spanish language. If you like videos like this one and you would like to support my channel, you can donate at my Buy Me a Coffee page, and the link is in the description box of this video. Now watch this next video.